That's a dead kid.
The young boy, mentioned in the earliest episodes, remaining mysterious and vague, the most information regarding the 7-year-old being the name on his gravestone, Michael Hammond. The creator of Petscop remaining unseen, yet his presence involved in nearly every aspect of the game, Rainer Newmaker. A seemingly harmless present, a dead child, and a man on a path of descent. In this video, all of these things and their relation to each other will be revealed, as well as the earliest days of Petscop's creation and its turning point into darkness. Today, we'll be talking about the Hammond family. So a lot of this theory rests on who exactly Michael Hammond is and how his death affected the story. That being the case, we will use him as the cornerstone of our evaluation and begin by dissecting everything we can about his character. Mike has to be important, as he is immediately shown in the first few episodes, where a lot of important foreshadowing and plot elements are initially introduced. On the surface, it at first seems there isn't much to be known about Michael. His first mention by video release order is in Petscop 2, where Paul comes across his gravestone next to Care's shed. It is here we learn he was 7 years old, having been born in 1988 and dying in the year of 1995. A singular phrase on his gravestone reads, "Mike was a gift." At this point, we don't have any idea why he's dead or how he died. His next mention is in Petscop 3, when Paul inserts the face from Mike's gravestone into the canvas system in the child library. A message appears saying Mike is not inside right now, he is dead. Mike's corresponding room is devoid of a child on the bed and contains a table with a lamp, a miniature red tool, and a pair of tweezers. The decorations on the floor have pictures of glasses and what looks to be the face of a dog. Mike has a brief and bizarre mention in the description of Tonith. He calls the bird-looking creature a funny, stupid blob monster. Another brief mention is in Petscop 11, when a line from Care's A description reads, "My brother didn't want us to find him, because he knew we were all looking for Michael A." There's then a long pause before we see anything new that's Mike-related, until Petscop 19 comes around with a recording labeled Mike 2. It is an early generation of the Petscop game, where Mike finds a digital Easter egg. And finally, on the 24th and second to last episode, we see Mike labeled as a painter in the credits, and we get a birthday letter written to him from Anna Mark. This is the concrete information we have on Mike from throughout the series, and while it at first doesn't seem entirely coherent, I believe we can formulate Mike's story and who he is in the larger narrative from the evidence we have available. Before we dive into the connections, I want to make one thing very clear. Almost all of Petscop's Newmaker plane and under the Newmaker plane elements were created by Rainer. This means pretty much all of what we see is told from his perspective, or is funneled through his lens of events. Just keep that in mind going forward. I think it's pretty obvious that Mike was important to Rainer in some capacity, as mentions of him keep cropping up throughout the game, and you'll notice that Tonith's description specifically is the one that goes completely off the rails, which included a mention of Mike. I suspect it could be due to Rainer's turmoil over the memories of the now deceased boy. The phrasing of Mike was a gift on his gravestone is further support to this idea, as we can see themes of the innocence of children throughout the game, but Mike is the only example of explicitly being called a gift. But if Michael Hammond is of such importance to Rainer, what exactly is their connection? Well, if you remember the line from Care's A's description, it seems Rainer is referring to Michael A as his brother. Furthermore, we see that Michael is playing one of the earliest versions of the game, participating in what seems to be an Easter egg hunt hosted by the Carolina office. If Michael was the younger brother of the developer of the game, it would make sense that he would be there to test the very earliest iterations. I would also like to say that I believe Rainer is actually Daniel. In the very same recording of Mike's Easter gameplay, the text box talks about finding the egg hidden in Daniel's game. Rainer is very obviously the developer of most of Petscop, so giving ownership of the game to a person named Daniel would be odd if they weren't the same person. Also, Daniel is a more ordinary name in comparison to the rest of the names in the series, and Rainer would make perfect sense as a pen name of sorts for Daniel representing himself within the Petscop game. From the research I've done into the name Rainer, it seems that it means strong counselor or deciding warrior. This can apply to Rainer in the fact that his whole part of the game was made in response to his investigation to Marvin and his past, and he was sort of bringing judgment to everyone involved through his final present of Petscop. And that brings me to my next point. All signs seem to indicate that Petscop was originally being made to be a genuine game for kids to play and enjoy, just a family-friendly pet-catching game for the new PS1. This is evidenced by the whole surface area of the gift plane and even care being very much conformed to this idea, as well as being unfinished as though it were abandoned. I think Daniel and Garalina were legitimately developing this game to be a fun kids video game at one point, and it eventually diverged into the dark mess of family secrets we see on YouTube. So at what point did this happen? Petscop had to have been being developed prior to Michael's death date in 1995, and prior to Easter as well, so at latest, Petscop had already been a developing concept as of very early 1995, and perhaps could have been being planned or talked about in 1994. Now, a lot of what Daniel is exposing Marvin and the Mark family for are the events leading up to, and around, and as a result of Care's kidnapping, which took place in the summer of 1997, until she eventually returned on her birthday in November. However, here's the thing. Daniel mentions in the Care description that he started this in 1996 for Marvin. So here's the thing about this. We just confirmed that the game had to have been already started no later than early 1995, which is a whole year before 1996. However, Daniel says in this that he specifically was making it for Marvin. So what I can figure is that Daniel's referring to the New Maker Plane part of Petscop, and 1996 is the year that the development of the innocent part of the game stopped, and Daniel began making the part we all spend hours investigating. The problem here is that, like I said, much of what we see in the game revolves around what has happened in and as a result of 1997. So whatever was the event that made Daniel begin this part of Petscop had to have happened prior to Care's kidnapping, which inspired a lot of what is seen. So this then begs the question, when and why exactly did Daniel start his investigation into Marvin and document it into Petscop? The only other mention of starting something was in Petscop 17, when Daniel writes that after hearing the strange story of Marvin putting up birthday girl signs and waiting on a bench with a birthday cake for his missing friend to come home, he spent a lot of time digging. Right after this, he says he does eventually find out what really happened to that girl, so it seems the digging he was doing here was looking into Lena's disappearance, which could have yielded a lot of information on Marvin's past. It's unclear when exactly Daniel heard this story and started his investigation into the matter of Lena, but it would make sense to me that it could have predated Care's disappearance in 1997, an event which is completely absent in these string of text boxes. That would explain why Daniel is already pretty wary and knowledgeable on Marvin prior to 1997 a little bit, but I believe there is far more to Daniel's and Marvin's relationship, the results of which motivated Daniel to make this dark portion of the game and to call out his history and crimes. So what were Marvin and Daniel up to prior to 1997? Well, we know Daniel at one point was also into facilitating the rebirthing process, as he explicitly says in Petscop 12 that he attempted to rebirth Belle into Tiara, although he believes that he failed to do so. However, in many of the notes and text boxes in the game, he seems to be very condemning of Marvin in regards to this process, and his tone generally sounds of disgust when discussing the topic. This means that somewhere along the line there was a paradigm shift for Daniel. At one point he himself was attempting the rebirthing of children, but eventually realized it was child abuse and became disgusted with it. Now, seeing as Marvin is the other major character known to attempt rebirthings, I think it's completely reasonable that he and Daniel were complicit with each other for a portion of the timeline. But what then would cause Daniel to work with Marvin to carry out the rebirthing ritual that mentally scars children? To answer that, let's look at Marvin's motivation for all of this. To me, it is obvious that Marvin desperately wants to get Lena back, and will even go to the lengths of attempting to rebirth his own daughter into her to achieve that. Marvin's descent into the rebirthing ideology began when Lena disappeared at the windmill, his grief and desire to have her back leading him into studying this cult-like practice as a means of resurrecting her in a sense. It would make sense if something similar is what set Daniel down this path as well. And what event do we know to have happened before the dark turn of Petscop? The death of his younger brother, Mike. I propose that just as Lena's death sparked Marvin's path into the study of rebirthing, Mike's death did the same to Daniel, as he was looking for ways to bring his beloved brother back. I suspect he and Marvin even worked together on it at first, with perhaps Daniel's initial inspiration for rebirthing coming from Marvin himself. But to get back to the point of all of this, why then was Daniel so angry with Marvin and inclined to dredge up his past as of 1996? I think part of it is that Daniel came to the realization as to what exactly the rebirthing was doing to these kids, and then became disgusted both with himself and Marvin, who was the main instigator of everything. The specifics of how I think the supposed rebirthing ritual works will be coming in a future video devoted to the subject. And while that is certainly an aspect of Daniel's hatred for Marvin, I think it actually runs much deeper. See, we still haven't answered the question of how exactly Mike died, but I believe I've figured it out. Just like the name of Michael Hammond, there's something else that keeps appearing, albeit vaguely and on the sidelines, consistently throughout the entire series. The idea of a car crash, or someone being hit by a car. Both Mike and the car crash are presented as though they are very important, but are elaborated upon very little, despite repeatedly reminding the player of their presence within Petscop. And I believe the reason for that is because it is the great tragedy that happened to Daniel, something he incorporates into the corners of his creation because it is in part what caused him to make it. Not only do I believe that Mike died by getting hit by a car, but I believe Marvin was the driver and the boy's birthday present is what doomed him. Let me explain. Mike died when he was 7 years old in 1995, and due to the letter written by Anna Mark seen at the end of the Book of Baby Names in Petscop 24, we know that he had a birthday party that year. In the note, Anna tells him he should thank his big brother for letting him play games all day and making him so popular, which is more evidence for Daniel and him being siblings. The note also informs him of a present that Carrie helped her pick out for him and specifically tells him not to shake the box. The first thing that comes to mind for me when a young kid is told not to shake a box is that the gift is some kind of pet. And lo behold, in Tona's description, the only catchable pet in Petscop to mention Mike, a dog, is also brought up. Furthermore, the dog is said to have been hit by a car, to which it now has a broken leg. You can probably see where I'm going with this. I think it's reasonable that the birthday party could have been being held in the Mark household, as I believe Daniel and Anna were somewhat close and perhaps co-workers in some fashion. More on all that in the next Petscop theory. And we can see that the in-game house was located directly to a big road. I think that Mike was given this dog as a birthday present, to which it ran into the road with the young Mike running after him, and the car crash occurred, killing Mike and breaking the dog's leg. And why do I say Marvin was the driver? Well, the only time we ever see the player get hit when crossing a road in the game is by an orange car, the same orange car that we see in Marvin's garage. Furthermore, Marvin's playthrough is the only time the message on Mike's grave lingers for longer than the gravestone is being viewed. We know certain generations and versions of the game were made for specific people to see certain things that aren't seen in other people's playthroughs, and Marvin's is the only one where Mike's gravestone message pointedly follows the player for a long time after viewing it. It feels to me as though it is meant to haunt Marvin, lingering on the screen to force him to remember his involvement in Mike's death. This would contribute greatly to Daniel's evident hatred for Marvin as of 1996, even before the events around Carrie took place. So why then would Daniel work in rebirthing with Marvin after he killed his beloved younger brother? For one, it does seem that Daniel acknowledges it was an accident. In the shadows of this window on the way to the tool room in Petscop 2, we see these two shapes colliding, and we see them again on a board game in the counselor room that is labeled with accident. Obviously, a car crash involving Mike would be the single biggest collision on Daniel's mind, and he does label it as an accident, so he wouldn't have attributed murderous intent onto Marvin. What I believe happened is after Mike's death from Marvin accidentally hitting him with his car after he chased the dog into the road, Marvin introduced Daniel to rebirthing in an attempt to give him a way to bring Mike back, just as Marvin had been trying to bring Lena back. Spawning from this was Daniel's experimentation with rebirthing and the eventual event of him trying to turn Belle into Tiara. More about both of those characters in an upcoming video. However, unlike Marvin, I believe Daniel came to recognize the depravity of the rebirthing process and broke off from it, going on to incorporate themes of how terrible it actually is within the Petscop game, and beginning his realization of how evil Marvin has actually become. But I don't think Marvin's involvement with Michael Hammond ends with the car incident. See, there's always been a couple of things that have bothered me about Mike. One, the pair of tweezers found in his room, and two, the line about him going missing in Care A's description. With all of the themes of Marvin being interested in children that aren't growing eyebrows, as that is a shared trait with his missing friend Lena, I always interpreted the tweezers as signifying that Marvin is plucking the eyebrows out of children he is thinking about trying to rebirth into Lena. We know that Daniel knows Marvin has tried this rebirthing thing with children before. Once again, more on that in a future video, because in the note from Care's room in Petscop 3, he specifically says, "I have a guess at which child you'll pick next," implying Marvin has already done something like this in the past. But why then are the tweezers found specifically in Mike's room of all places? Let's switch gears for a second and talk about the line from Care A's description. "My brother didn't want us to find him because he knew we were all looking for Michael A." At some point, Michael was missing in some capacity, and didn't want to be found because he was no longer the A version, Daniel's interpretation of an innocent and untraumatized kid. Something had to have happened to Mike before he died, where he had to be found and was traumatized enough for Daniel to consider his A self having been taken away. Does this remind you of anything? It largely parallels Care's story. Care A goes missing, turns into Care B, and eventually to NLM. In Daniel's mind, Care A is never going to be able to come back. Daniel believes that once a person is traumatized, they will never be the same again, as evidenced by the line, "When Care A goes missing, she goes missing forever." So what then happened to Mike that predates his death, seeing as he was capable of not wanting to be found, that would strip him of being Michael A and presumably become Michael B? As said earlier, there are a pair of tweezers, a utensil that can be used for plucking out eyebrows, a facial feature that Marvin is obsessed with, specifically in Mike's room. I propose that Marvin briefly kidnapped Michael as part of his rebirthing children experiments. Once again, let me explain. The main question this proposes is, how did Marvin do this without being exposed to his family? Well, I don't think Michael knew who he was assaulted by, as he never got a clear look at his face. You'll notice that the head on Marvin's character sprite is not clear at all, any features nearly completely unrecognizable. Furthermore, there is a title that Daniel gave himself on the note he attached to the Petscop game, that being Shadow Monster Man. Daniel believes that he has become a Shadow Monster Man, and why would that be? Well, what's the one thing that Daniel would feel more guilty about than anything else? His involvement in the rebirthing process that he came to find was just psychologically damaging children. He also seems to portray Marvin as a Shadow Monster Man, as when that mode is activated in the game, it is the only time the windmill with the Lena spray inside is visible, and the only time the player can get hit by the orange car. With all of this in mind, Daniel is calling both Marvin and himself Shadow Monster Men. Now, I wonder where exactly this phrase comes from. It always seemed a little corny to me, childish even. And you know a kid in the series who uses the word monster to describe things? "Funny stupid blob monster," says Mike. I believe that when Marvin took Mike to enact some of the rebirthing procedures to get Lena back, involving the removal of eyebrows, he stuck to a veil of darkness, his true identity being hidden in the shadows. So when they found Mike again, most likely after Marvin realized rebirthing him wasn't going to work or abandoned the idea for some reason, all Mike could describe his kidnapper as in his young mind was a Shadow Monster Man. And all of this is the reason why Daniel eventually describes himself as this as well. When he realizes the true horror of what this attempted rebirthing process is doing to children, he also realizes he has become the same thing that once traumatized his younger brother, the very thing that he hates. I suspect it was the startling revelation that also clued him in on the fact that it must have been Marvin who made Mike briefly disappear and kickstarted the angry vendetta he has against him throughout the Petscop game. why he became so obsessed with Marvin in 1996, and began his journey to dig up all of the events of his past and reveal all the skeletons in his closet through the new maker plane that Daniel added into the unfinished Petscop game, a game he once dreamed of his brother happily playing with his friends. From there, through his obsessive investigation, he would learn of the windmill incident, find the pictures of Marvin and Lena from 1977, discover evidence of the other children Marvin was trying to rebirth, and even do some other morally questionable things that we will talk about in the next video. All of this had him fully prepared to help the Mark family in their search for care after she was kidnapped, and add those events into the game he had already begun making to condemn Marvin. All of this, the tragedy of his brother, his discovery of Marvin's evil deeds, and the part he played in the rebirthing process of Belle, contributed to the way Daniel would ultimately decide to end his life. Overwhelmed with sadness and loss, and most importantly, overwhelming guilt and disgust at his own actions, he decided it was better to end it all than go on living. The last thing we hear from him is his gifting of the Petscop game to the Mark family in Christmas of 2000, and then he asks to use the bathroom. The end of Care A's description asks the player to check your bathroom now. I believe the bathroom they are to be checking is not the bathroom in the game, but their physical bathroom, as the intended players were the Marks. There is a music track in the final episode titled Bathroom Tomb, in the room that is connected to Marvin's bathroom, and the ramp that leads into the bathtub has no way to get back out. And we also know that Daniel believes once someone suffers trauma, they will never be the same. Remember he was the only one who wanted to put the dog down after it suffered a broken leg from the car crash? How he said the dog only faked its happiness? I think that was also Daniel talking about himself. Anytime he appeared happy, it wasn't true. Ever since his brother had died, life had just been more suffering for him. So, just like he wanted to do with the dog, he considered he could never be happy again, and he wanted to put himself down. If you think about it, every member in the Mark family contributed in some way to Mike's death. Marvin, of course, is the one who actually hit him and traumatized him before all that, but Anna was the one who got the dog, and Carrie was the one who picked it out. This is why in Care A's description, Daniel writes F you all, instead of just F you or F you Marvin. The entire Mark family has contributed in some way to his descent. But before he would do that, he would create the underworld part of Petscop, his final gift to the Mark family, a vessel to lay bare all of their deeds and show them everything they had done to result in his misery. Then, he would end his days in their own home, showing them all the consequences of their messed up family, only leaving behind his game of Petscop and his body lying in their bathtub. I can't help but view that moment that the message on Mike's gravestone refuses to leave the screen during Marvin's playthrough being Daniel's way of saying, "Look what you've done, and look what you've made me do." Ever since I first watched the second episode of Petscop, something has haunted me. What happened here? This theory permeates a lot of understanding as to how the Petscop world works, and as such, be prepared to go down different tangents and rabbit holes as they come up. The immaterial glue that is tying the topic of this video together is, of course, the windmill. However, so much spawns from this singular moment in time that there is a plethora of other things to talk about, such as Lena Leskowitz, the presence or lack thereof of supernatural events, the psychology of Marvin, and even parts of Daniel Hammond's journey not mentioned in the video dedicated to his family. So, let's start at the simplest and most obvious spot, the beginning. The earliest date seen in all of Petscop is 1968, the birth year of Lena Leskowitz, who is one of the most mysterious yet reappearing characters in the series. However, the earliest date associated with an event of any significance to us is 1977, the fateful year that three children visited an old windmill in the fields of Connecticut, those being the two sisters, Anna and Lena Leskowitz, accompanied by their friend Marvin Mark. Before we start connecting the dots, let's assemble everything that we know about things that relate to the windmill. Now, as discussed at length in the theory shown on the screen and linked in the description, most of the scattered clues and puzzles that comprise the story of Petscop are delivered to us through the perspective and lens of Daniel Hammond, who goes by the alias Rainer Newmaker in-game. Thus, we have to fast forward time by 20 years to get to the point when Daniel was conducting his investigation into Marvin and his past. Between the years of 1996 and 2000, Daniel Hammond was on a quest to unravel the secrets of the Mark family, and I believe this specific instance of rummaging through Marvin's personal belongings took place just before Anna kicked Marvin out of the house in their divorce. During this search, Daniel came across two pictures that had been taken by Anna 20 years ago during their visit to the windmill. One picture showed Marvin and Lena standing together in front of the windmill, while the second photo shows Marvin standing alone with no windmill or Lena present. Curious about this, Daniel traveled to the site of the windmill himself, only to find that it was gone. In the notes he leaves in the game of Petscop, he describes the windmill as vanishing into thin air, and that Lena was never seen again. He also gave a riddle that he claimed helped explain what happened at the windmill, also involving two pictures. The riddle stated that one photo had an image of a closed door, and the other of the same door opened. The riddle further specifies that the door was never even opened at all, and ends with the question of what happened. This riddle is a prime example of a theme that is present throughout a lot of the Petscop episodes, the idea of perception and deception. The doors are only visible to us through photos, and photos can famously alter the version of events that we see, as, after all, our eyes are subject to what is revealed in the photo. If the door never opened at all, then it must be two photos of the same door in the same position. Some have posited that is a revolving door, and that it harkens back to the prominent theme of rotation throughout Petscop, but alternatively, it could be a picture of the door at two different angles. One angle, our eyes see the gap that makes the door open, and one angle is faced so that we can't, creating the illusion that it is closed. In conclusion, the door never opened because it was never closed. And as Daniel said at the beginning, this relates back to the windmill. Similar to the doors in the photos, the windmill never disappeared. It was just an illusion created from what we can see in the photos. Anna was the one holding the camera, and she snapped a picture of Marvin and Lena before they went inside. And after they emerged, she took a photo of Marvin this time with her back facing the windmill, making the second photo be of Marvin alone in an empty field that could easily look like where the windmill had once stood. In the cutscene from Petscop 6, we literally see Marvin rotate the camera placed in front of the windmill 180 degrees, which I think is further support for this idea, even if it is subtle. Now, the obvious rebuttal is, Daniel went to the location and confirmed that the windmill was no longer there. But remember, Daniel did this around 20 years later. The old windmill could have very well been torn down by then. So if all this explains the mystery of the windmill's alleged disappearance, what then happened to Lena, who supposedly disappeared with it? You'll notice that earlier I assumed that the trio went inside the windmill. This scene from Petscop 9 is exactly why. When the player Paul, in Shadow Monster Man form, enters the windmill, he sees none other than an in-game model of Lena spinning amongst the gears. Now, the only other major appearance of Lena comes in the form of a gravestone in Petscop 17. After walking a backwards trail and getting information on Kara's family tree, the player is prompted to ask what happened to the girl that disappeared around here. Upon entering the question, a gravestone ominously rises from the ground, showing the name of Lena Leskowitz, along with her date of birth and death. Across the gravestone is the short message of "they didn't see her." We discussed this line's potential relation with the theme of a car crash present in Petscop, but more successfully linked it to Michael Hammond's death in the previous theory video. So what does this phrase mean? Well, obviously Marvin and Anna never found Lena, otherwise they would have no reason to believe that she was missing. And given the fact that Daniel represented Lena through a model of a person spinning amongst the gears of the windmill, and then with a gravestone later on, I think after the trio of friends are exploring the innards of the windmill, as horrible as it sounds, Little 9-year-old Lena fell into the gears and was horribly twisted to death before she even had a chance to scream. Marvin and Anna didn't see her fall into them, and they missed her body when they exited the windmill looking for her. That's why they didn't see her. And there's more chilling evidence for this being the case. Daniel talks about how he went over to Anna's house to help her paint over the stencils Marvin had drawn on the walls, and during this time, he saw Care, who was just 5 years old, spinning around the house. What sets this event off as really strange is that Daniel puts an emphasis on how watching Care spin disgusts him. He calls out the different stages of degrees that she's rotating, and specifically uses the language of winding and tightening. Now, normally a child happily spinning around wouldn't make someone's face contort in horror and disgust as Daniel describes it. Daniel must be associating it with something else terrible that he previously experienced. Taking this way down to Petscop 23, when we find Care B in the closet, one of Daniel's final notes alludes to going grave digging with a shovel icon dancing across the screen, accompanied by the board game literally called Grave Robber, set in a field with windmills that starred in the episode prior. I think, during his investigation of the site of the windmill, Daniel realized that Lena must have died there, and in a crazed obsession for the truth, decided to go digging for her remains. In Petscop 22, during his conversation with Belle, Paul notes how when he put the coordinates for the windmill into Google, he finds that there's only a small stone where it used to be. Sure sounds like an unmarked grave to me. When the windmill was taken down, it is possible that Lena's remains were found, but due to their disfigured nature and however long had passed, she was impossible to identify, so they buried her into the ground where she was found and commemorated it with a stone. Under this interpretation, Daniel could have seen the stone and knew that he needed to go grave digging. However, I can also see an interpretation where she was simply missed entirely when the windmill was taken down, and Daniel was the one who set up the unmarked stone for Lena. In any case, I believe Daniel plunged his shovel into the dirt until he uncovered Lena's body, found it wind and tightened, twisted and torn apart. His mind could fill in the gaps as to what happened, and the horribly painful way that Lena had died was seared into his mind. Thus, when he saw Care, who we know must at least somewhat resemble her late Aunt Lena due to Marvin being so bent on the fact that she is her reincarnation, he was starkly reminded of the child's grave he had once dug up to discover her horrible fate. That's why his face contorted into pure horror and disgust at seeing Care spin around. And stemming from this one tragic event in 1977 comes the entire rest of the timeline of Petscop. This traumatic experience that happened to Marvin when he was just a kid would change the course of his life forever, sending him into an obsession with bringing his missing friend back from the dead, resorting to whatever means of depravity that he thought it required of him, such as psychologically manipulating and abusing children, or even kidnapping and trying to rebirth his own daughter. Marvin's descent into insanity is what swept Daniel into the entire rebirthing ritual after his brother Michael was killed in the car crash, and prompted him to go to the trip down the rabbit hole that resulted in the dark side of the Petscop game. The events that took place at this windmill, the death of Lena, it's the catalyst for the entirety of the Petscop story. But wait. Practically hear you yelling at your screen. But Playmaster, you forgot one crucial thing. You completely overlooked something that would change everything. You excluded your argument's greatest contradiction. Well, rest assured, dear viewer, I have not neglected the final scene in the series, the gift at the end of the playlist upload. And, oh boy. Girl who has been mentally scarred by Petscop's creator. A mysterious name unto which frighteningly little context is attached. A cult-like ritual bent on raising the dead through the rebirthing of the living. All of this, and their connection to one another, is explored in this video. Welcome to another Petscop theory. If you haven't yet watched at least the two big theories prior to this one, which are showing on the screen and linked in the description, I recommend you do so that you aren't lost on what I'm saying, as these theories build on one another, at least somewhat. A disclaimer before I dive into this one. We are now diving deep into the weeds of the Petscop lore. In my last two theories, the fateful tragedy and the catalyst, I used various pieces of evidence and clues from across the entirety of the Petscop series, intricately putting them together like a puzzle to reveal what I believe to be the truth about the story. However, we are now entering territory where increasingly little evidence exists, and we have to employ more speculative tactics in order to garner the story. Granted, I strive to keep all of my speculation based in the tangible facts that we already know, but the truth of the matter is that Peskov has some things that are simply not elaborated upon enough to provide high quality and tangible evidence for a theory, and those are now the subjects that we have arrived at. If you watched the Catalyst theory, you'll remember that I left it on a note where one big mystery went unanswered. I am saving the answers for that particular mystery for my final official Petscop theory video, as I believe it is imperative that this video and the one I plan to release after it come out first in order for you guys to fully understand how I'm viewing the different moving parts of the series that go into the overarching theory. All of that being said, right now we are talking about the rebirthing process that Marvin Mark and Daniel Hammond dabbled in, as well as two characters named Tiara and Belle. Now, the specifics of how Daniel got into this mess are given in the fateful tragedy, and the reasons for Marvin's obsession with it are given in the Catalyst, so once again, please go watch those if you haven't already. On a base level, the idea of rebirthing is changing one person over into another. In the Petscop series, we only ever see examples of people trying to turn children into someone who is deceased, so it stands to reason that is a ritual devised to return loved ones to the world of the living through the vessels of children that are meant to be their reincarnations. Children are more than likely chosen because their minds are volatile and easy to manipulate, and they are far closer to the day of birth than the older people. If they are changed over young, they also don't have as much time to develop their own independent personality that differs from the person the rebirther wishes for them to be. From different notes left by Daniel, and of course typed in dialogue from Marvin, we know that there are some major elements that must go into rebirthing, those being a child, music, a certain amount of willingness to be reborn from the child, psychological manipulation, and a machine that, when all put together, is confused for a form of supernatural resurrection. Before we go further, let's first confirm each of these elements with evidence from the series. Anytime rebirthing someone is brought up, the specific instances being of transitioning Belle into Tiara and Karen to Lena, the person going through the ritual is a child. Kara was 5 when Marvin kidnapped her, and while Belle's age is technically unknown, given her interactions with Paul in 2017 and 2018, it is easy to assume she is within the window of his age, meaning that when Daniel tried to rebirth her into Tiara, somewhere between 1995 and 1997, she was also quite young. We know that music is a vital element because Daniel states how he played Stravinsky's septet upon putting her into the machine, and Marvin places an emphasis on teaching Paul how to play music within the game and talking about how people before him played bad music when preparing for the in-game simulation of rebirthing KRB. It seems that a specific melody is assigned to different people, and the melody of the person you want to rebirth must be played on a piano during the process, as seen when the subtitles say things like Care's melody or Paul's melody. Thus, Stravinsky's septet must be related to Tiara in some way. Marvin probably had a tune associated with Lena, and Paul was meant to play Care's melody during the in-game simulation. But instead, he played his own tune that the subtitles dubbed Paul's melody. During this process of music playing, the child is put into a machine, whose appearance and function is elaborated upon very little. It looks like this is the in-game simulation, but who knows how accurate this PS1 recreation is. In the game, you need to assemble 1,000 pieces to activate it, but I believe that was just a device to force the player to find the many hidden areas and secrets of the game where collecting enough of those pieces is possible. This way, it forces players like Marvin to see the whole thing like Daniel intended. Given that in the game simulation it swivels Care B around, it could very well be a means of isolating the child from the outside world while the music is playing, then bringing them back to resimulate a coming out of the womb moment. This plays into the final component. The psychological abuse and willingness of the child. Given Daniel's wording, the message that says, if you hadn't given up halfway, you would be Tiara, and combining this with the entire concept of the quitter's room that shows up as early as episode 2, it seems that the child being rebirthed has to be complicit to a certain extent, as Daniel believes that Belle wasn't reborn because she gave up. Furthermore, I think this helps explain some of the psychological abuse and manipulation that Marvin employed on his own daughter, Care. We see in Petscop 20 that he showed her a warped reflection of her face and was trying to convince her that she was ugly. I think the adults do this in order to try and make the child want to be someone else, or at the very least, not be happy with who they currently are, so they will do their part of perceived importance in the rebirthing ritual. Now, as to why I believe the rebirthing ritual is a complete farce that grieving people have convinced themselves is true in a crazed obsession with bringing dead loved ones back, there's not a single reliable time in Petscop that rebirthing has been successful. Sure, Daniel says that he believes he found evidence for Care being Lena reborn, but so does Marvin, and they're both lunatics pushed into insanity due to the deaths of Mike and Lena respectively. Belle believes she has been reborn into Tiara, but not even Daniel believes that one. Like I just said, psychological manipulation is used on these children. Belle is probably hopelessly brainwashed to believe that she is Tiara, despite this ritual being another cult-like practice with results that are only believed in but not factual. So that is the entire process and reasoning that goes into rebirthing, a theme that has been present in Petscop from beginning to end. But what about the character of Tiara? Who is she, and how does she fit into all this? She is scarcely mentioned in any large capacity, but she must hold relevance of some kind. After all, Daniel specifically tried to rebirth Belle into her, and Belle has been running around believing and claiming that she is Tiara's reincarnation. I think the most reasonable answer can be derived from the one piece of dialogue we get from Tiara delivered to us from Daniel. Tiara says that a child can be psychologically damaged beyond rebirthing. This line indicates two things to me. One, that the psychological manipulation of a child for this process must be done carefully and intricately. The child needs to desire to be reborn and have the fortitude to not quit halfway through, but they also can't be mentally scarred too much, as then they will be too tainted to even be convinced they are someone else. In my view, this adds another layer of depravity to the whole situation, as it's made almost like a scientific process on these kids. Secondly, this tells me that Tiara is knowledgeable on the rebirthing subject, and therefore probably an adult. Also, given the fact that Daniel is trying to rebirth her, it is reasonable to assume that she is dead for some unknown, perhaps even mundane reason. My proposition about Tiara is that she was perhaps the one who originally taught Marvin and Daniel about the rebirthing procedure. As just previously said, she's an adult knowledgeable on the subject, and Marvin had to get this idea in his head somewhere, which Daniel was then obviously introduced to through him. The reason I believe Daniel was trying to get her back was so that they could get back to the source of the teachings on rebirthing, a sort of trial run before Daniel, as I postulated my theory all about him and his family, tried to use the rebirthing process in an attempt to bring his dead brother Michael back to life. This is a plot parallel to Marvin's descent into his madness, his obsession beginning with the death of his childhood friend, Lena. So to recap, the rebirthing process is a ritual bent on resurrecting a dead loved one into a child, a flawed and ultimately fraudulent ideology adopted by grieving adults who would do anything to bring their loved ones back from the dead. Tiara was a woman who was knowledgeable on the subject and who perhaps introduced and trained Marvin in its ways while he was searching for a way to resurrect Lena. Tiara dies at some point, and Marvin passes on the ideology to Daniel after accidentally killing his brother in a car crash, giving him an avenue to get his beloved brother back. Daniel tries to first bring Tiara back from the dead before moving on to his brother, but fails in doing so. As he stated in this note, it seems he once truly believed Care was Lena reborn. I think it makes sense for Daniel to believe in the farce that is rebirthing until the combination of the failed rebirth attempt with Belle and the realization that Marvin was the one who had kidnapped Mike and plucked some of his eyebrows out and it got him to realize the true depravity of the situation. I think his paradigm on the whole thing shifted, which contributed to the haunting feelings of guilt, which contributed to his decision to end his days. Something we talk about in great detail in the video dedicated to the Hammond family. The rebirthing process is something that Daniel once believed in, which is evident in some of his notes left in Petscop, but I believe that he ultimately discovered that it was a false dream of crazed adults who are in reality doing nothing but mentally scarring young children for life, something that he did to Belle in pursuit of bringing Tiara back. However, I do believe there's perhaps one instance where the rebirthing ideology is extending beyond just raising people from the dead, instead becoming a brainwashing tactic to get information. Not only that, but it has expanded beyond its roots, having become a family conspiracy resting in the abandoned halls of an elementary school. Horror stories come in various forms, and the exact nature of Petscop's story is a debated topic. I've been a long-time believer that Petscop is all about the humanity, and does not incorporate supernatural, or as some claim, advanced artificial intelligence elements. This video explains exactly why. This will be a much shorter Petscop theory, as is really just to tie together what my past 3 theories are subtly communicating about my perception of the series. I find that the themes of Petscop lie in the human emotions and the results of trauma, as do pretty much everyone else that has watched the series. However, some try to incorporate more fantastical elements within that story, such as ghosts or artificial intelligence within the game, or converging timelines and even rotating universes. I believe that none of these are the case, and Petscop is meant to be a story that could be almost conceivable to happen within the real world. Obviously, in order to back this claim up, we need to be able to explain some of the more strange elements of Petscop in a natural way, and over the last 3 videos, that's exactly what I've been doing. Obviously, I can't re-say everything in this video, so please go watch The Fateful Tragedy, The Catalyst, and Secrets of Rebirthing, if you have not yet done so, that is, as there will be only incredibly bare-bones explanations given here. In The Fateful Tragedy, we go over Daniel Hammond's journey and the death of his brother, Mike. Almost everything I say in this video is backed up with evidence found within the Petscop series, and none of it requires any stretch of the imagination like applying something supernatural or fantastical in order to explain the events. At the end of the day, it is all about taking what we see in the series and coming to a conclusion that requires the least amount of speculation and uses the most evidence. When it comes to Michael and Daniel Hammond, it wasn't too difficult to do that. However, there are some things that are harder to explain, like the disappearance of a girl and an entire windmill, as well as the rebirthing aspect of the series. In The Catalyst, we discuss the events surrounding the earliest moments of the Petscop timeline, namely, what happened to Lena and the windmill. Using loose ends and notes scattered across the episodes that link back to this event, it is able to be reasonably explained within the confines of natural reality in a narratively satisfying way. This feels much more reasonable than going to high-concept sci-fi by incorporating shifting timelines or parallel realities, as some will do. My most recent video, called Secrets of Rebirthing, spent the majority of its time detailing how the entire rebirthing process is ultimately misguided and untrue. Petscop never displays a reliable depiction of an actual rebirthing being successful, and this is my major point to the supernatural debate. Every time Petscop displays something potentially supernatural, it redirects the attention back to the grounded themes of humanity while subtly providing roots for the events to take place naturally. It feels very much like the series is trying to create an atmosphere of uncertainty while ultimately not believing in its own potential supernatural elements. Thus, the simplest answer is that Petscop is a story devoid of supernatural plot points, and ultimately, the absence of such wacky concepts puts more emphasis on the human emotions, which Petscop has excelled at from the very beginning. Now, the idea of advanced artificial intelligence is another topic that is brought up when discussing the Petscop story. While far from the only interpretations, 2 big examples are the game theory interpretation and the Nexpo interpretation. I find both of these to be substantially flawed, and both use the artificial intelligence angle. Game theory specifically suffers from the fact that it was put out before the last few episodes came out and it never went back to include them. However, both game theory and Nexpo was upon the fact that a powerful AI was intrinsic to the Petscop story. You should go watch their videos for their full explanation, but both of these guys present an AI that is unreasonably powerful for today's gaming possibilities, let alone when Petscop was made for the PS1 in the 90s. And while, yes, the capabilities of Petscop are advanced for the 90s and the PS1 anyway, they aren't unreasonable enough that you can't suspend your disbelief and just accept the fact that Daniel and Garalina were just incredibly good game designers for the time. Many of the instances where people will apply this advanced AI idea, I believe can be explained by the fact that Petscop records all controller inputs and is capable of playing them back at pretty much any time. Furthermore, some of the weirdness in the videos can be explained by editing shenanigans. We know the people forcing Paul to play this and the overseers of the Ghost Room are censoring and cutting stuff, so it stands to reason that they could be doing different things to the video footage that make it weird, such as this strange time skip and repeat sequence in Petscop 11. As for how the avatars of Belle and Marvin talk with the player, I do believe that Petscop can host multiple players in a game through different consoles. While this does seem impossible for a PS1 and PS1 game, it's the type of technology advancement that isn't so unreasonable you couldn't fathom how it would be possible in this fictional universe. These avatars have to have real people behind them, given the specifics of the typing and the different personalities present in the messages. All in all, the purpose of this video was to call out the fact that everything within Petscop can be explained through natural means. And given that these natural means are usually the simplest and most evidence-backed paths, I strongly believe that Petscop is not a story about supernatural events or advanced AIs. The themes of the story always point back towards the emotions of humanity and how trauma affects young people, while directing attention away from the supernatural possibilities and providing natural solutions in the background. At long last, after over a year's worth of time, my final Petscop theory has arrived. This might not be my last Petscop video ever on the channel, as I would like to make an ultimate Petscop timeline at some point, but that will probably be pretty far off. A major announcement I have, though, is that I've written a book-length Petscop fanfiction that is linked in the description and is available to read for free. I consider it to be the culmination of all of my investigations into Petscop, and it can serve as the official Playmaster Plus canon. Before I begin this video, I would like to make a couple of more disclaimers. One, this is the theory that took me by far the longest to create, and while it's pretty much impossible to tell what's correct in the Petscop series, and specifically this period of the timeline, this represents what I personally believe. Second, I want to say that I understand I'm going to say some crazy and potentially controversial things in this video. We have arrived at a place where there is woefully little evidence, and more speculative theorizing is required to construct a coherent storyline. Thus, what I'm presenting can easily not be believed by those of you with differing opinions, as we're at a largely ambiguous area that relies on layers of personal interpretations. All that being said, let's dive into my final Petscop theory. My previous four theories leading up to this one laid the foundations for what I believe about the Petscop universe and how it works. If you haven't yet watched them, please do so before continuing, as they are vital to understanding the overarching theory that I'm presenting. After everything, we are left with the biggest and most difficult questions about Petscop. What is the nature of the relationship between Paul and Care? What are the details of the family conspiracy? And what on earth is the story of Lena supposed to even be? In order to tackle the question about Care and Paul and their identities, it is practically required that we go over the major theory out there, and from what I can tell, the main idea is that Care turned into Paul through some method. There are some other smaller or less popular theories concerning the subject, but the one that is definitely the most widespread and arguably has the best argumentative points to it is the aforementioned theory of Care becoming Paul. There are a few moments throughout the series that people have called out as potentially hinting towards this fact. Paul doesn't know who Care is, despite being exactly the same age and even sharing a resemblance with her, which is heavily suspicious. And all things relating to Carrie Mark go radio silent beyond the year 1997. And given that a central plot point of Petscop is rebirthing and identity reassignment, it is possible that Care, in the wake of her mental trauma from the fallout of the events in 1997, became Paul in her mind. We also know that Paul's connected to Care's family, and that Marvin even is his dad, as shown here. Paul was writing no, no, no. He was actually writing on the third time, starting to write DA. Could he possibly be writing dad? More thoughts on this coming in a future video. So no matter what, Paul has to be the son of Marvin and by extension probably Anna, which would make him at the very least Carrie's brother. So it seems we are left with two plausible options. Paul is either a twin brother of Care with very little mention in the game of Petscop, or he is Care's new identity. If you've watched my previous videos, it's obvious that I don't believe anything supernatural to be occurring in the Petscop world, nor do I think rebirthing has any validity to it. Therefore, I cannot reconcile the Paul's Care theory within the argument that she was literally reborn into him through the ritualistic practice of rebirthing. Given that, if Paul is indeed Care, then it must be through some psychological means. And while this may sound a little forward, as I slightly alluded to in the podcast where I ranked all the episodes of Petscop, I don't believe that Paul is Care. Let's go over why. While I understand that Care could have suppressed her memories, I feel like it wouldn't be to the severe extent we would see in Paul if this were true. Paul initially doesn't bat an eye at any of the characters within Petscop. He sees the model of Care very early on and doesn't even flinch at it. Even the name Marvin doesn't seem to initially strike any semblance of memory within him when he first encounters it. And I think even if he suppressed the memories of the trauma that occurred to him back when he was Carrie, there would be some sort of reaction, some sort of internal gut reaction. But Paul doesn't even act like a little suspicious that the game has ties to him until he finds his room in the child library, to which then he only acknowledges the other things as signs along the way, where in reality they should have been monumental giveaways. He even still notes that the game is connected to him through you, to who he is talking to in that case, probably Jill. While I do understand the connections that people make to the Paul's Care theory and see the validity in those that believe it, I personally can't say that I am of that mindset. I just don't believe there are enough of the nuances present in the Paul character that I would need to see to confidently get behind him being Care prior to the modern events. So, what exactly do I think is the case surrounding Paul and Care and their relationship? If Paul in fact isn't the same entity as Care, these questions still need to be explained. Where did Care go after 1997, and why isn't she present in the story beyond that date? Why are there so many intentional connections and similarities drawn between Care and Paul? Why doesn't Paul show up much in the Petscop game? Who even is Paul and his connection to the family? I'll start this off by saying plainly that I believe Paul is Care's twin brother. They look alike and have exactly the same birthday, as well as the same parents, so this should obviously be the case if Paul isn't literally Care. This explains why they are similar and why Paul has such a deeply rooted connection to the bloodlines interwoven into Petscop. As for what happened to Care, as we see throughout the series, and especially in Petscop 23, Marvin is still an active character in Paul's time. I think that Anna was crippled with fear after Carrie was kidnapped in their own home, that she sent her off to live with relatives elsewhere so that Marvin wouldn't have a way to find her should he wish to come after her again. Even if Marvin got jail time following Carrie's return in 1997, which we don't really have any evidence for either way, he would have been released more than likely in the window of 3 to 5 years, given research into other sentencings in the wake of similar parental kidnappings. Which honestly, if Marvin got caught and was sentenced with 3 years, that would perfectly coincide with Daniel's gifting of Petscop and unaliving in year 2000. In any case, I believe Anna got Carrie into the care of other relatives in order to protect her from the insanity of her ex-husband, and then probably became overprotective of Paul. Paul being a brother would make sense with his memory of seeing Raynor at a birthday party, which would probably be Michael's. If he suppressed his memories as Care, it would be weird that that specific one slipped through the cracks, because it would be around the same time that he should have been Care. Now, the big problem here is why doesn't Paul remember having her as a sister? On the path to answering that, I would like to establish some views I have on the Belle/Tiara character. We know that Daniel attempted to rebirth Belle into Tiara at some point, and we talk about that more in the video showing on the screen. I think the relationship Belle and Paul have are step siblings. Paul mentions early on about Belle coming home, which probably suggests they live or once lived in the same house, and it was established a couple of times that Belle isn't legitimately family. I think she was most likely a foster kid that Daniel, by whatever series of headcanons you would like to apply, had the opportunity to try and rebirth. It seems that Daniel was racked by guilt in the wake of this, and perhaps in his guilt, he felt he should organize getting Belle a home, putting her somewhere safe, which parallels nicely with what we see in Petscop 23 when Belle's and Paul's eggs rest together in the locker. Daniel seems to hold some respect for Anna and even maintain some relationship with her after some of the tragedies that happened, given that he helped her repaint her bedroom. I imagine that sometime after Carrie was returned from being kidnapped, but before Daniel unalived himself, within that window of time, he was able to goad Anna into adopting Belle. How this ties into everything gets even more into the weeds. After the events of 1997, I think Anna became hyper vigilant in protecting her children, even sending Carrie to live with relatives that are distanced from everything. I think she also became paranoid about sheltering Paul, doing everything in her power to keep the tragedies that surround the family away from him. I think this could also explain why Paul doesn't appear much, if at all, in the darker parts of the Petscop game that Daniel created. I bet he was probably aware of Anna's wishes and desires to keep Paul safe and sheltered from all of this, and subsequently didn't insert him or put any mention to him into the Petscop game, complying with her measures to keep him in the dark. I think in an attempt to preserve Paul's ignorant bliss, Anna was able to gaslight his young mind into believing that Belle had always been his sister, and in all that, convinced Belle to put her misconception regarding her perceived Tiara identity on the down low, as given her encounter with Daniel, she had already been dragged into the depths of all of this. In Carrie's absence, Belle's presence, and his mother's gaslighting, I think Carrie disappeared from Paul's mind altogether, as Belle, his stepsister, became the sibling that he always had in his memories. This would also explain why Paul has very little recognition of any of the other events going on in Petscop at the beginning, as his mother had been actively keeping the family secrets and darkness away from him. Until, of course, Paul found Petscop, sending him down a road that he was perhaps always destined to find, which transitions us into our next topic. One thing that bothered me was why the family even allows these videos to be put up on YouTube. Clearly, they want something censored, as seen in multiple instances, so why not just prevent Paul from documenting them at all after discovering their channel? I suspect that since the first few videos got high in view count, they wanted to appease the people who knew about it to a certain extent, following Petscop until they could discover how to access the credits to sort of present a bookend to the viewers, so that the diehard investigators wouldn't try and bother their actual family. Perhaps they are even glad about the angle that this was just another creepy internet story if you look at it in a meta sense. We know that this operation turned into a little family conspiracy as well, given the ghost rooms that they were keeping Paul and potentially others in as well. To talk about motivations here, I believe that Jill, mentioned as an aunt to Carrie, is her aunt through her father's side, making Jill Marvin's older sister. I believe that Jill and Thomas are the parents of Daniel, which fulfills the mention of him being Carrie's cousin. While this does mean that Jill would have to be significantly older than Marvin, given the fact that Daniel would most likely be born sometime in the mid 70s, big age gaps between siblings do happen, and it doesn't break the timeline in any meaningful way, so it's fine. With her brother being the main catalyst for both of her children's death, the car accident with Michael and Daniel's unaliving, I bet she's on a quest to get vengeance against him by deriving all of his crimes that Daniel laid bare in Petscop, as well as fully exploring the game that was her son's dying gift to the family. On the other side, I think that Anna also wants to discover all of the secrets that Daniel put into Petscop that relate to her family, and now that Paul stumbled into it, it is time for him to learn the history of his bloodline through the game as well. The ghost rooms are a measure probably mainly enforced by Jill and her side of things, a way to ensure that the consoles running Petscop never get turned off and are consistently being played by trapping people like Paul in there with nothing else to do, racing to the finish when it comes to completing Petscop and discovering all of its secrets. I think the moments in Petscop where it shows things from later in the timeline, from after it should have stopped being developed, is a result of tampering that Jill and Anna were able to do to it somehow through the Tarnacop machines. On that note, here's another big claim. I think that Anna was once the boss of the Gary Lena company. I think that's why Lena was in the last half of the company's name, Anna having named it after her dead sister, and also why the only mention of an office we see is directly called Anna's office. It also makes sense how in this playthrough, Marvin asks the tool, "Who is your boss?" as he could suspect his ex-wife had a hand in all this. That being said, I think through whatever developmental powers that the Tarnacop machines have, and whatever advanced technology that Petscop has that allows users to have personalized copies and connect to the same game world with one another over PS1s, Anna and Jill were able to manipulate the game in certain parts to add new elements, despite that being seemingly impossible. This would explain things like the strange situation sequence where Paul sees a mimic of a conversation he had in the real world after he already discovered and started playing Petscop. It would also explain the in-game version of the ghost rooms in the upper level of the school and the burn-in monitor protocol. These were additions made into the game around the modern day by Anna and Jill, which is why they can at times feel out of place or roughly inserted, as well as contain modern events within them. So, to what end would Anna and Jill do this? I believe they are trying to do a pseudo rebirthing within the game in order to have the player, specifically Paul, be put into the metaphorical shoes of Carrie to both discover the secrets of Petscop and where she ended up on November 11th. That would explain the instance of trying to convince the player that they are Carrie Mark through the quote unquote curse that changes one's past. This also parallels what I believe Anna did to Paul when he was a child, changed his past within his mind. These additions that Anna and Jill figured out how to insert into Petscop are all meant to help prod Paul in the right direction that they themselves might not even be completely sure of, muddying his identity with cares to put him in the right headspace for discovery, whilst also providing in-game simulations of the modern status quos of places like the school. I would suspect that the real Carrie was too traumatized to speak about what happened to her when she was a child, especially about where she was after escaping the school before finding her way back home, and perhaps had even selectively suppressed those specific memories from herself. I bet Anna didn't want Paul to find Petscop and go down the rabbit hole into his family's darkness, but that he already had and had been thrust into it anyway, she saw the opportunity to milk Petscop of all of its secrets once and for all, and perhaps even get some closure on the events surrounding her ex-husband Marvin and her daughter Carrie. Maybe Daniel had even meant for Paul's copy of Petscop to be for Carrie in the first place, which is why his avatar has a red triangle for a head that parallels the reflection of Care's face in the red triangle we see in the caskets in Petscop 20. Maybe Anna wanted Carrie to be away from all this once and for all, so she hid her copy away in the house for Paul to eventually stumble onto in 2017 and get wrapped up with everything. It would make sense given the other personalized copies Daniel made, one for Marvin and one for Belle, Carrie being the other major kid involved in all of this. And as said before, now that Paul was the one actually playing this copy, Anna and Jill saw it fit to merge Paul's life with Carrie's within the game, and attempt to goad him into going the right ways in Petscop through psychological means. This would even fit the phrase of the ghost room is a ship in a bottle, an explanation I gave for the likening in a prior video. They are intricately manipulating the player on the inside from the outside, monitoring Paul's play and intellectually orchestrating him through their changes to the game. And what became the ultimate goal in all of this? I believe catching Marvin so they could put all the stress of him continuing to be out there behind them once and for all while satiating the internet through partially censored uploads of the game. Before I tie my scattered theories all together, we now need to discuss one of the most frustratingly confusing aspects of Petscop, the seemingly contradictory nature of Lena's existence within the universe. In this video showing on screen, I discuss at length as to why Lena must be dead. A couple more supporting evidences that I didn't mention in that video being the fact that Marvin says she tripped and fell and is lost when trying to teach Paul the melody he wishes for him to play during the rebirthing sequence. Marvin is obsessed with bringing Lena back through rebirthing, so who else would he be realistically referring to here? And Lena tripping would make sense given the falling into the gears explanation that I elaborate upon in the aforementioned video. Also, Marvin was originally going to type in the tool question menu, "Did you dig up Lena?" or something along those lines, before changing it, suggesting he might believe that Lena is dead. All that being said, combined with what I feel like to be overwhelming evidence of Lena's death in my The Catalyst video, I believe we need to find some way to explain Anna's words in the note after the credits and the entirety of the soundtrack sequence without the continued presence of Lena beyond 1977 being an option. After some heavy studying of the series, I came to a conclusion that satisfies me, but I understand it might not appeal to everyone based on how they weigh different evidence. I believe the lines in the end credits note from Anna display her suffering from her own mental illness. She mentions to Mike that he should thank his other auntie for making this all possible, but only if he sees her, to which she says that not everyone can. I think living with Marvin and his continually growing insanity, combined with the lasting trauma of her sister's disappearance, affected her brain in a way that made her start to think that she could actually see Lena there with him, hence the claim that not everyone can see her. Imagine being married to Marvin and living with his slow burn descent every day, blending with whatever lasting trauma Anna would have had from the windmill trip, as we know that she certainly stuck with Marvin for the rest of his life, and I bet it was a situation where Anna couldn't escape the crazy, so she became the crazy in a sense. convinced herself that Lena was still there, that she was just as instrumental to the company that Anna named after her as she was. During this period of time, she was so stuck within her mind about it that she even included it in a birthday card to her nephew. I think this displays Anna going through mental struggles as well, as many of the characters do in this series, but I think her motherly love was able to help her overcome them, while Marvin instead delved into a sociopathic like state, which led to him mentally scarring and trying to rebirth his own daughter. This gives depth to the Anna character, as well as shows that the impact of Lena's disappearance is felt by all people involved in her life. This is why Daniel has the name Lena output as boss in Petscop. We know Daniel loves his thematic elements that he constantly puts throughout the game, and when you put it into a perspective of being a video game and entertainment medium that often includes a boss presiding over everything and acts as the final force to overcome, I think Daniel made the dialogue system output Lena as boss to reflect that the influence she inadvertently has over everyone's lives is what is driving the entirety of the events that took place within Petscop. Her life and death is what started Marvin down a spiral of insanity, as well as other moving parts of the family, which obviously bled out into pretty much everything about Petscop as discussed in my prior theory videos. And if only Marvin could have overcome her as an obstacle, everyone would have won, so to speak. If Marvin was able to conquer his mental scars in the wake of her death, pretty much all the other tragedies could have been avoided. Lena is the metaphorical boss of Petscop. Even the company that started development on the game was named after her. Her presence presides over everything, and she is felt in different ways by everyone, despite the fact that she died decades ago. Now that leaves us with one major mystery to solve. What the heck was Belle going on about in the soundtrack sequence? I believe that relates back to Anna desiring to lure back Marvin, putting him into enough legal trouble to put him away for a while, finally giving her peace of mind and that she ensured the safety of her children. This confusing monologue comes specifically from Belle, and if we are to take it at face value, this means that Lena is not only alive, but is somehow Paul's mother. From everything I've already said in this video, it's obvious I think this is impossible to be the case. All this being typed by Belle, who we know is a big believer in the whole rebirthing thing, as she believes that she was successfully rebirthed from Belle into Tiara. I think this is why she seems at least semi-complicit with Marvin in the sequences that we see them together. He is a big proponent in trying to rebirth people, and since Belle believes she is a reborn person, she could be convinced that on the fact that some people should be rebirthed. Marvin still refers to her as Belle because he probably knows that the rebirthing process should have been a failure by the standards that he had more than likely passed on to Daniel after learning them from the original Tiara. More context for all that in the prior videos. That being said, I think Anna knew of Belle's interactions with Marvin through the Petscop game and decided to use her in an attempt to lure Marvin back by convincing Belle that Anna had been reborn to her sister. The plan would be for Marvin to catch wind of this belief through his interactions with Belle over Petscop and come after Anna, which would put him into the trap they were setting for him that would finally get him into the proper legal trouble they believed he deserved. Plus, if Marvin believed that Anna could have become Lena, he would no longer target the children, keeping them safe from his depravity should he take the bait. This is why Belle talks to Paul here as though Lena was his mother, because she believes that Anna, his mother and her adoptive mother, is Lena. And all of this dialogue comes from Belle specifically, one of the people in the series that seems to genuinely believe in rebirthing. I don't think that's a coincidence. This parallels her question that she asks Paul, "Do you remember being born?" The question is inherently absurd, as the answer is of course not. Nobody remembers being born. But if Belle believes rebirthing counts as being born once again, then it is probable that you would remember that event. Belle believes that she remembers being born because she was reborn into Tiara, while most people don't remember being born at all. Paul's been manipulated into believing lies and mistruths ever since he was young, even continuing to be mentally manipulated through his family conspiracy and Petscop investigation. Paul doesn't remember the truth of his birth now, doesn't remember having Carrie as his twin sister. What he does remember, though, is having Belle as his sister in her place. And after all of this, even though they weren't biologically connected, she was still his family. This is a complicated web of personal beliefs, all coming down to the main constant themes that run throughout the entirety of Petscop: trauma, misconception, deception, and family lies and secrets. I think Anna's plan began to work in a way that she didn't expect it to. Marvin discovered that his son was on Petscop and then became interested in using Paul to help him find things within the game to further progress and eventually combine their pieces together to power the machine and trigger the ending of Petscop. However, I believe that along the way, Marvin decided that Paul might be a good candidate to target in the real world. Perhaps the boy could somehow help him find where Carrie was, or perhaps Marvin thought he could use him as a substitute to rebirth into Lena instead, not falling for Anna's intended deception through Belle about being Lena. He would know that it wasn't possible, as he's convinced of a certain process rebirthing needed to be delivered to. Anna probably saw this as an almost equally good opportunity to lure and capture Marvin. Paul was being kept in the ghost rooms in the school, and if Marvin came after him, they could ambush him. What I believed happened in Petscop 23 is Marvin finally deriving the specifics of Paul's location from him and finally deciding to come and abduct him, to which Belle warned Paul to push the bed against a hidden door, delaying Marvin from getting inside. From there, he was probably stopped by Anna and Jill and whoever else is working for them in this conspiracy, probably more family members or former Garolina employees. This accounts for the pause of unknown amounts of time due to the cut in Petscop 23. Now, the main question under this is, why does Marvin continue to play afterwards? Well, I suspect that this is part of Jill's obsession to fully finish and explore the game her son made, and that they trapped Marvin in a ghost room of his own in that school, finding his console and letting him continue to play in order to see what the end of the game had in store. This gives some poetic justice. Just as Marvin once trapped Carrie in a room in this school building, now he was the one trapped in a room in the very same building. All this probably contributes to why Marvin was so overtly mad in the ending sequence. Not only was he at the mercy of the family that his actions had haunted for years, but Paul didn't even carry out the simulated rebirthing the way he wanted him to. While it isn't clear what would have happened if Paul had actually played Kare's melody, Marvin's plans were thwarted, both in the real world and in Petscop. Paul playing his own tune instead of Kare's melody as instructed symbolizes the breaking of the cycle, the closing of the loop, the fact that he will finally be the one who breaks the generational curse of trauma and allows the family to move forward from their dark and tragic past. Like Petscop has repeatedly told him, he is the new maker. And while not every little mystery was solved, while not every detail of the secrets surrounding his family are known, that's okay, because Belle and Paula bonded together through this. And now, although we don't get to see it, they will continue to investigate this together, unraveling the secrets surrounding them, not as friends, but as family. Unraveling Petscop was the first series I started on this channel, and it's crazy that after over a year it has finally reached its conclusion. As mentioned before, I do want to release an Ultimate Petscop timeline video, but that will be far off as I have a lot of other content planned to come out before then on different subjects. In the meantime, if you want to see the specifics of my headcanons on how all the moving parts of the Petscop universe work and relate to each other, please check out my novelization of the Petscop series, a book-length fanfiction that I wrote that is linked in the description and is available to read for free. Thank you to all of those that have watched my Petscop videos, and I invite you to enjoy raking me over the coals for everything I said that you disagree with in the comments below. I'll be back someday with the Ultimate Petscop timeline, but until then, I hope you'll keep up with my other content, and as always, it's been Playmaster.